Welcome to APEM's webinar, where we'll be discussing taking an integrated catchment-based approach to the management of invasive non-native species. Just as a note, we use the term invasive non-native species, INNS, and invasive species interchangeably throughout the webinar. So just as a way of introduction, my name is Paul Stebbing. I lead APEM's invasive non-native species team. I'm joined by my colleague Hannah Tidbury, who is a principal consultant in our INNS team, and will be presenting part of this talk with me. So just to give a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today, I'll go through a brief introduction to APEM and our INNS team, what invasive species are, going through to catchment to coast, the concept, understanding and managing risks, catchment level evidence, and then a few slides on future outlooks. So moving on to APEM. APEM provides an independent environmental consultancy and scientific advice to a broad range of clients. We combine expertise in ecology, water, geospatial analysis, environmental assessment, and nature-based solutions. We help our clients understand the interaction between landscapes and seascapes, enabling informed decisions that affect biodiversity, support sustainable development, and build resilience to the future of global markets. So I mentioned that we'd talk briefly about the invasive species team. So I lead the team, and which Hannah sits in, as well with 7 other invasion ecologists. We draw on expertise across ecology, environmental monitoring, risk assessment, providing solutions to prevent, detect, and manage invasive non-native species, helping clients to protect ecosystems, infrastructure, and natural capital throughout the entire catchment. As a team, we have expertise in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial invasion ecology management. So some of the key areas that we cover include risk assessment, process development and delivery, biosecurity options, appraisals and planning, monitoring and surveillance planning and delivery, rapid response and contingency planning, management and control, feasibility assessments, as well as the strategic planning for whole business as well as countries. So first off, what are invasive species? So invasive non-native species are organisms that have been introduced either deliberately or accidentally by human activities to locations outside of their natural range, causing harm to the environment, the economy, or human well-being. So invasive species are now recognised as one of the most significant threats to the health of our rivers, coasts, and the connected catchments. They disrupt ecosystems, outcompete native wildlife, damage infrastructure, and impose substantial economic costs on communities and industries. Some well-known examples that you can see on the right are signal crayfish, Himalayan balsam, and mitten crabs. Referring to the graph on the left-hand side, from an introduction point, a species can spread rapidly through a catchment via natural dispersal and human activities. This could be, for example, from a reservoir where signal crayfish have been introduced, or a garden on a river from which Himalayan balsam could spread, or from an estuary where populations of mitten crabs have been established. Ideally, the most cost-effective course of action is to prevent the introduction of an invasive species from occurring in the first place, with subsequent management actions such as eradication, containment, becoming less likely to be successful and more costly as the species spread over a wider area. So moving on to what is the catchment to coast concept and how this relates to invasive species. So the catchment to coast environmental management is an integrated approach to managing water, land, ecosystems, and human activities across the entire water continuum. So from the headwaters of a catchment all the way down rivers, through estuaries and out to sea. The core idea is that what happens upstream directly affects downstream environments, including coastal waters, beaches, and marine ecosystems. Instead of managing each part separately, it takes a more holistic, integrated approach to understanding how upstream activities shape downstream conditions, such as water quality, sediment flow, biodiversity, and marine pollution, with these principles also being applied to the identification and delivery of management actions. In the context of invasive species and their management, the concept acknowledges that species can spread through interconnected waterways and human activities across an entire landscape. This includes upstream movement through natural dispersal mechanisms or human activities. So activities lower down in the catchment can have impacts higher up. A good example of this is with mitten crabs, which have been introduced into an estuarine environment and then subsequently spread upstream. The challenge of managing invasive species is rarely confined to a single location, as what begins as a local introduction can rapidly become a catchment-wide problem. So in acknowledging this connectivity, it shifts our focus from isolated interventions to coordinated actions across the entire freshwater coastal continuum. By understanding how invasive species travel through waterways, how human activities accelerate their spread, and how management decisions in one part of a catchment influence outcomes in other parts, we can design more effective, preventative and resilient strategies. I'll now pass over to Hannah, who will provide an overview of the approach we take at a catchment level as far as invasive species management is concerned.
Thanks, Paul. So when we're developing and implementing invasive species management at catchment level, we typically follow a 5-stage evidence-based framework. And this comprises stakeholder mapping, pathway identification, invasive species distribution analysis, risk assessment, and tailored and targeted management measures. I'm going to cover each one of these stages in turn. So identification of key stakeholders and engagement with them is really crucial to the success of invasive species management. And at a catchment level, there's often a large number of stakeholders and a diverse range of stakeholders. And these can include regulators and authorities, land and resource managers, infrastructure and industry, environmental and research partners, and communities and water users. And these have often got various different roles, interests, and influences on invasive species management. And this can lead to some challenges, especially in respect to coordination and collaboration. But we can overcome these challenges, for example, by early engagement with stakeholders, clear communications, raising awareness of the impacts of invasive species and the benefit of management of invasive species, and also through kind of clearly identifying roles and responsibilities that stakeholders have. And we can also improve engagement and uptake of stakeholders by allowing them to input into decision making, because that fosters trust and a sense of ownership. So this stage is really about identifying who is operating within the catchment, but actually it's also really useful in the initial identification of pathways relevant to the catchment, because it allows us to build a picture of the activities being undertaken by the various stakeholders. And this leads us to the second stage of the framework, which is around pathway identification. And when we refer to pathways, we're really referring to the routes and mechanisms by which invasive species can be introduced into a catchment and spread within a catchment. Pathway identification is really important for targeting management actions and supporting pathway management, where the risks of introducing and spreading invasive species via a pathway can be managed. So here are some key examples of some of the pathways that we may find across a catchment. So recreational activity can spread invasive species through the movement of people, equipment, and watercraft. Transport networks and vehicles can also contribute to the spread of invasive species. Invasive species spread can also be facilitated by water infrastructure. Development and construction activities can also contribute to the spread of invasive species, for example, through the movement of machinery and materials. And agriculture can also provide a potential pathway through the movement of machinery, soil, crops, and livestock. And aquaculture and fisheries can also pose a potential pathway, in particular through the movement of equipment and stock. And as well as looking at human-mediated pathways, we can also consider natural dispersal pathways, including water, wildlife vectors, and wind. So having identified these crucial pathways, the next phase is really to understand the invasive species that may be moved by these pathways. And this leads us on to the third stage of the framework, which is invasive species distribution analysis. And this really helps us to identify invasive species source populations and also invasion hotspots. So this process really starts by collating occurrence records from various different sources, including national and local databases. Where appropriate and where necessary, we'll supplement these records with targeted surveys that we may need to undertake to address species coverage gaps and spatial gaps. And we'll combine these data and map them. And this is really to provide an oversight of the distribution of invasive species in the catchment. We don't only consider invasive species that are already present in the catchment, we also consider horizon species. These are the species that are not currently present within the catchment, but have the potential to arrive and establish within the catchment. So at this stage, we understand who's operating within the catchment, the relevant pathways and the relevant species. But to really understand the kind of priority and risk across the catchment, we need to bring these data together, think about risk factors and a catchment context. Which brings us to the fourth element of the framework, which is risk assessment and prioritization. So we know that risk can vary quite hugely across a catchment, so we take quite a structured approach to identifying and studying risk factors with respect to pathways, invasive species, and the catchment itself. So in terms of pathway risk factors, we tend to consider the frequency of pathway activity and the level of or intensity of pathway activity. In terms of invasive species risk factors, we'll consider the distribution and abundance of the invasive species, its spread potential, impact potential, and also the kind of practicalities and feasibility around its detection and management. And in terms of the catchment itself, we'll consider its vulnerability and sensitivity in terms of the location of sensitive habitats, of protected species, and also commercially important industry and infrastructure and assets, as these may be disproportionately affected by invasive species that are introduced into the catchment. And we integrate these data together alongside information on catchment pressures such as pollution and climate, and an understanding around management capacity and existing management initiatives to really define and determine where these areas of risk and priority are. And this data-led process provides an understanding of priority and high-risk areas in relation to stakeholders, pathways. It underpins targeted mitigation, monitoring and management, allowing proportionate management with respect to risk and also allowing for localised conditions. It allows a shared understanding, which facilitates coordination and collaboration. And providing this kind of standardised output allows us to update it, track changes, essentially adapt our approach to maintain the efficacy of management over the longer term. So the fifth stage is around the development and implementation of tailored and targeted management. And we often consider INNS management according to the underlying objective, because these potentially require slightly different approaches. So if we're developing and designing management to prevent introduction, we focus on high-risk pathways and activities and involve biosecurity measures, awareness raising and training, and monitoring early detection. And when we're developing and implementing management action to prevent spread, we focus on new and localised populations and include rapid response, containment measures, and targeted control. And for the management of established populations, we focus on widespread species and priority receptors and long-term control to reduce impacts, monitoring and adaptive management to ensure efficacy over the long term. And just before I finish my section, I just wanted to highlight one of the key benefits of a catchment-based approach, which is around the shared evidence that it promotes. So this shared evidence allows for improved data, which provides a clearer understanding across the whole catchment. It provides more efficient use of resources, which avoids duplication and focuses effort where it has the greatest benefit. It also improves decision making, providing stronger evidence and greater confidence, and also provides stronger collaboration, which enables faster detection, rapid response, and that kind of improved coordination. And it's this shared evidence base which allows this positive feedback, so we're able to assess the success of management, adapt our approaches, and ensure that invasive species management across the catchment is effective and proportionate and targeted in the longer term. So I'll now pass back to Paul, who's going to provide some real-world context to the framework that I've presented.
Thank you, Hannah. Right, so one of the areas that really this catchment-to-coast management approach for invasive species would be really beneficial is in relation to the water resource management planning and the river basin management plans. So these are directly tied to the effective delivery of both of these, where invasive species can affect water quantity, water quality, ecological status, and the resilience of both catchments and coastal waters. So managing them as part of a connected system ensures that upstream actions prevent downstream impacts and vice versa. So in relation to the water resource management plans, impacts on water quality, for example, where you have species like Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed destabilizing riverbanks, increasing erosion and sedimentation that reduce reservoir capacity, could be much more effectively managed under a catchment-to-coast approach, and so therefore aid in relation to water companies delivering their water resource management plans. Likewise, aquatic plants like floating pennywort and choke channels, reducing conveyance and increase flood risk. Zebra mussels, for example, can impact on infrastructure by clogging pipes and takes and treatment works. So taking a more holistic approach to the management would aid in ensuring the water resource going forwards into the future. Likewise, for river management plans, invasive species are a major pressure category under the river basin management plans because they reduce ecological status. So this through outcompeting native species, altering habitats and food webs, changing sediment and nutrient dynamics, affecting fish migration and spawning. So the catchment-to-coast management provides the integrated framework that links really the water resource management plans and the river basin management plans together through the shared monitoring, the shared interventions, the shared governance, the shared outcomes, ensuring better ecological status and more resilient water supply. So we end up with healthier rivers, estuaries and coastal waters. So we found in our work that managing invasive species at a catchment scale is more effective, efficient and sustainable than isolated based interventions, especially where single site management is often subject to the issue of reinvasion. So by thinking beyond individual sites, we can manage pathways, connectivity and cumulative impacts across the landscape more effectively. So this is really building on a shared evidence base that Hannah described to support robust decision making and coordinated actions. So we've identified 5 priority actions really that we feel be useful to take forward as far as catchment-to-coast approaches to invasive species management is concerned, and that's really prioritising the catchment scale planning, targeting the pathways and source populations, really making sure that biosecurity is embedded and is holistic part of the planning process, and that these investing in the long-term management and adaptive management, which is really something that catchment-to-coast can facilitate very effectively, and really strengthening those partnerships and cross-sector collaborations. So if invasive species spread through networks, then management must really operate at the network scale as well. So thank you ever so much for listening to our webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact our invasive species team via our website. So thank you very much.